They'd survived 8 years eating rotten rice and rat meat. Now they stared at steak and ice cream, unable to believe it was real. February 12, 1973, Clark Air Base, Philippines. 67 American prisoners of war sat in the medical facility cafeteria, freshly released from North Vietnamese captivity. Most weighed barely 120 pounds despite being over 6 feet tall. Their skin hung loose on skeletal frames. Some had broken bones that had healed incorrectly. Others bore scars from torture that would never fully fade. All carried psychological wounds from years of isolation, brutality, and systematic dehumanization in places they'd nicknamed the Hanoi Hilton, the Zoo, the plantation grim prisons where survival had been their only daily goal. Hours earlier, they'd walked off North Vietnamese transport planes onto American soil for the first time in years. Some had been shot down in 1965, others in 1967, 1968, 1972. Navy pilots, Air Force officers, a few Army soldiers all had experienced variations of the same nightmare. Capture after ejecting from damaged aircraft, interrogation accompanied by torture, years in cells barely large enough to lie down, systematic starvation, denial of medical care, isolation designed to break their spirits. Commander James Stockdale had spent 7.5 years in North Vietnamese prisons for in solitary confinement, subjected to torture sessions that left permanent injuries. Lieutenant Commander Everett Alvarez had been held for 8.5 years, losing 40 pounds in his first weeks of captivity from inedible prison food that included animal hooves, chicken heads, and meat covered with hair. Captain John McCain had suffered repeated torture, broken bones left unset, years without speaking to another American.
They'd survived on 2 cups of rotten rice per day, occasionally supplemented with pumpkin soup so thin it was essentially water. Protein came irregularly, sometimes rat, sometimes snake, once an unfortunate cat the prisoners killed and were punished for. Medical care was non-existent except when North Vietnamese needed prisoners healthy enough for propaganda filming. Disease was constant. Dysentery, beriberi, infections from untreated wounds, parasites from contaminated food. The psychological torture had been as systematic as the physical. North Vietnamese captors labeled them air pirates and war criminals rather than prisoners of war, claiming this exempted them from Geneva Convention protections. They were forced to record false confessions, write letters denouncing America, participate in propaganda activities. Refusal meant torture. Beatings with fists and rifle butts, hours suspended by ropes in positions that dislocated shoulders, waterboarding, prolonged isolation in leg irons. The internal code the POWs developed was simple. Resist until you're at the edge of losing rationality, then do whatever necessary to survive, but take the physical torture first. It was a calculus of endurance. How much pain could you absorb before breaking? How many days in isolation before madness? How much starvation before death? In late 1969, after Ho Chi Minh's death, conditions had improved marginally. Torture decreased. POWs were allowed to meet each other after years of isolation. Food portions increased slightly. Mail became possible, though heavily censored. But improved was relative. They were still starving, still imprisoned, still denied basic human dignity. The Paris Peace Accords in January 1973 finally mandated prisoner release. Through February and March, North Vietnam released American POWs in groups, transporting them to Hanoi's Gia Lam Airport where U.S. Air Force planes waited. The POWs called this Operation Homecoming, their return from hell. The C-141 flights took them to Clark Air Base in the Philippines, the first stop before continuing to America. During the flight, medical personnel performed initial assessments. The men were skeletal, damaged, traumatized. Many wept during the flight, unable to believe they were finally free. Others sat in stunned silence, afraid this was another North Vietnamese psychological trick, that they'd wake up back in their cells. When they landed at Clark, nurses and doctors overwhelmed them with medical attention. Physical examinations revealed malnutrition, parasites, untreated fractures, infected wounds, dental disasters. Psychologically, many showed signs of severe trauma. Nightmares, hypervigilance, difficulty trusting, fear that captivity wasn't really over. After initial medical processing, they were told dinner would be served in the cafeteria. The men filed in nervously, still moving with the careful wariness of people who'd learned that any moment could bring punishment. They sat at tables, and kitchen staff began bringing out food. Before we continue with this powerful story, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Lost Portraits. We preserve the encounters of humanity found in history's darkest and brightest moments. Comment below telling us where you're watching from. Your support helps us honor these stories. Now let's return to Clark Air Base, where 67 men who survived hell are about to experience something they haven't known in years: abundance. This is a story about the shock of returning to humanity after years of deliberate dehumanization. It's about men who'd survived on rotten rice and torture, discovering that the world they'd left still existed, that abundance was real, that they weren't forgotten. In February 1973, as America struggled with the Vietnam War's bitter ending, these prisoners returned carrying knowledge of suffering most Americans couldn't imagine. They'd been conditioned by years of deprivation to expect nothing, to survive on minimal calories, to never trust that food or kindness was genuine. Their captors had systematically denied them everything: adequate food, medical care, communication, dignity, hope. Survival had meant accepting that suffering was permanent, that rescue was unlikely, that each day alive was a small victory. Now they sat in an American cafeteria, about to receive their first real meal in years. What appeared on their plates would challenge everything they'd learned to accept about their new normal. Because after years of believing they'd been forgotten, that nobody cared, that they might die in those cells, they were about to discover that America had never stopped fighting for their return. The kitchen doors opened, staff began serving, and 67 men who'd survived unimaginable cruelty confronted something they hadn't experienced in years: someone caring about their hunger, their comfort, their humanity. To understand the depth of these men's shock, we need to understand what they'd endured and what had been taken from them. Lieutenant Commander Everett Alvarez was shot down on August 5, 1964, becoming the first American pilot captured by North Vietnam. He ejected from his damaged A-4 Skyhawk, was captured by Vietnamese militia, and taken to Hoa Lo Prison in Hanoi, the facility Americans would nickname the Hanoi Hilton. He'd spend 8.5 years there, longer than any other American POW. His first weeks established the pattern that would define years of captivity. He was placed in Heartbreak Hotel, a section where new arrivals were interrogated using psychological manipulation techniques borrowed from Chinese communist methodology. 8 hours daily of questioning, designed to break resistance and extract propaganda confessions. The food was immediately, horrifyingly inadequate. His first meal consisted of rice with what appeared to be chicken, until he realized he was eating chicken heads, complete with beaks and eyes. Other meals included animal hooves floating in watery broth, rotten fish, pieces of meat covered with hair and crawling with maggots. He vomited constantly, developed severe diarrhea, lost 40 pounds in 3 weeks. Only when guards realized he was dying from malnutrition did they switch him to thin rice soup. It kept him alive, barely. This became his standard diet: 2 cups of rice daily, occasionally supplemented with pumpkin or cabbage soup so watery it provided almost no nutrition. Protein was rare, maybe once a month some unidentifiable meat, usually rotten. As more pilots were shot down and captured, the POW population grew. Each man arrived with his own shoot-down story but encountered the same systematic brutality. Commander James Stockdale was captured in September 1965 after ejecting over North Vietnam. He'd spend 4 years in solitary confinement, subjected to torture designed to force propaganda confessions. The torture methods were systematic. The ropes, strappato, involved tying hands behind the back and suspending prisoners in positions that dislocated shoulders. Beatings with fists, clubs, and rifle butts. Waterboarding. Prolonged confinement in leg irons in cells too small to stand or fully lie down. Denial of medical care unless prisoners cooperated with propaganda efforts. The North Vietnamese justified this by claiming American pilots were war criminals conducting illegal bombing, not legitimate prisoners of war. This semantic distinction allowed them to ignore Geneva Convention requirements for humane treatment. POWs were denied communication with families for years, denied medical care, denied adequate food, denied basic dignity. The isolation was its own torture. Many POWs spent months or years without speaking to another American. To combat this, they developed the TAP code, a communication system using wall taps to spell out messages. Prisoners in adjacent cells could talk by tapping messages, sharing information, maintaining sanity through human connection even when denied face-to-face contact. Captain John McCain was shot down in October 1967 during a bombing mission over Hanoi. He ejected with both arms and a leg broken, nearly drowned in a lake before being pulled out by North Vietnamese civilians who broke his shoulder with a rifle butt and bayoneted him. He was taken to Hoa Lo prison, denied medical treatment for his broken bones, left to heal improperly. When North Vietnamese discovered his father was a Navy admiral, they offered early release for propaganda purposes. McCain refused, adhering to the military code that prisoners should be released in order of capture. As punishment, he endured a year of systematic brutality, tied in ropes and beaten every few hours until he signed a forced confession. He spent 2 years in solitary confinement, 3.5 years without speaking to another American until a civilian pilot arrived in an adjacent cell and they could communicate via tap code. The psychological warfare was constant. Guards told prisoners they'd been forgotten, that America didn't care about them, that families had moved on and remarried, that the war was lost and they'd die in captivity. Isolation amplified these lies. With no outside information, prisoners couldn't know what was true. Food remained the daily torment. The standard menu across all North Vietnamese prison camps was rice, sometimes 2 cups, sometimes 3, always rotten and full of bugs and rat feces. Because camps were in remote areas and supplies had to be transported long distances, the rice was often moldy, contaminated, barely edible. When supply lines were disrupted, prisoners ate whatever was available: elephant, ape, snake, dog, rat. In one camp, starving POWs killed the guard's pet cat and tried to eat it before being caught and punished. At another, prisoners foraged for manioc and wood, burning more calories in the search than the food provided, but it was that or starve. Guards ate better: chicken, eggs, pork when available. POWs could see and smell this food being prepared but rarely received any. The contrast was deliberate humiliation. Your captors eat well while you starve, proof of your powerlessness. Before releases or Red Cross visits, guards would improve food temporarily, adding meat and vegetables, even sweets. This created psychological torture of its own, moments of abundance that reminded prisoners what they were missing, then returned to starvation rations. At one Christmas, guards gave 12 prisoners a single can of condensed milk to share. Whether this was mockery or genuine resource scarcity, the effect was the same: a taste of sweetness followed by return to deprivation. The medical neglect was equally systematic. Broken bones weren't set. Infections weren't treated. Dental problems became disasters. Many POWs lost multiple teeth to untreated decay and abscesses. Disease was constant: dysentery from contaminated water, beriberi from malnutrition, malaria, parasites, infections from wounds or torture. Some POWs died in captivity, from combat wounds that weren't treated, from disease, from torture that went too far. 65 Americans died in North Vietnamese captivity. Survivors lived with the knowledge that each day could be their last, that no rescue was coming, that survival depended entirely on endurance. After Ho Chi Minh's death in September 1969, treatment improved marginally. Torture decreased in frequency and severity. POWs were moved to larger group cells, the section of Hoa Lo they called Camp Unity, where they could finally interact, worship together, share experiences. Food portions increased slightly. They received warmer clothing and occasional mail from home. But improved meant they were merely surviving rather than actively dying. They were still prisoners, still malnourished, still denied adequate medical care, still psychologically tormented by uncertainty about when, or if, they'd ever go home. When the Paris Peace Accords were signed in January 1973, mandating POW release, many couldn't believe it. Years of false hope had taught them not to trust announcements. Only when they actually boarded North Vietnamese buses headed to Gia Lam Airport, when they saw American Air Force planes waiting, when they felt the aircraft lift off Vietnamese soil, did they begin believing freedom might be real. The flight to Clark Air Base took hours. Medical personnel tried to prepare them for what came next: examinations, processing, eventual return to America. But the POWs were processing too many emotions to fully absorb information. They were free, but freedom felt surreal after years where survival was the only certainty. Now they sat in a cafeteria at Clark Air Base, about to eat their first American meal in up to 8.5 years. They'd survived on rotten rice and torture. What came next would challenge their understanding of what was real, what was possible, and whether anyone had actually cared they were suffering. The cafeteria staff began serving, and 67 former prisoners of war sat frozen, unable to process what they were seeing. The plates being set before them contained real food. Not rice, not watery soup. Real, abundant American food. Grilled steak, mashed potatoes with butter, fresh vegetables, green beans, corn, dinner rolls still warm, real butter, milk, coffee, and for dessert, ice cream. Commander Stockdale stared at his plate for a long moment before whispering to the man beside him, "This can't be for us." His confusion was echoed across the cafeteria. After years of deprivation, the POWs couldn't reconcile the abundance before them with their lived reality. Their minds, conditioned by years of starvation rations, generated explanations. This was a mistake. The food was meant for someone else. It would be taken away any moment. This was another psychological trick. Lieutenant Commander Alvarez picked up his fork but couldn't bring himself to cut the steak. He'd spent 8.5 years eating rice and rot. The piece of meat on his plate was larger than his entire daily food ration in Hanoi had been. It smelled real. Char from the grill, fat, seasoning. But after years where nothing good was genuine, where kindness was always prelude to cruelty, he couldn't trust it. A Navy nurse, Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, noticed the paralysis. She'd been briefed on what these men had endured, but seeing their reaction to simple food made the abstract horror concrete. She approached Alvarez's table and spoke gently. "It's real. It's for you. You're safe now. You can eat as much as you want." Alvarez looked up at her and she saw tears forming. "All of it?" he asked. "This whole plate?" "All of it," she confirmed. "And seconds if you want. Thirds. Whatever you want." He cut a small piece of steak and put it in his mouth. The taste and texture overwhelmed him. Real beef, cooked properly, seasoned, tender. He began crying as he chewed, unable to stop himself. Around the cafeteria, similar scenes were unfolding as other POWs took their first bites and confronted the reality that their suffering had ended. Captain McCain ate slowly, mechanically, as if afraid sudden movements would make the food disappear. His injuries from torture made cutting the steak difficult. His arms had never healed properly, but he refused assistance. After years of helplessness, he needed to feed himself, needed the autonomy even if it was painful. Some men ate with desperate intensity, shoveling food as fast as they could, driven by years of hunger that couldn't be satisfied in a single meal. Others ate tiny portions, their shrunken stomachs unable to handle abundance after years of deprivation. Several became sick, eating too much too fast after prolonged malnutrition, and medical staff had to gently intervene, explaining they needed to eat slowly, that their bodies required time to adjust. The ice cream created the most profound reactions. Many POWs hadn't seen ice cream since being shot down. Some hadn't tasted it in 8 years. When bowls of vanilla ice cream with chocolate sauce were placed before them, several men broke down completely. It wasn't just food. It was proof that the world they'd left still existed, that America was real, that they'd actually survived to return home. Commander Stockdale accepted his ice cream but couldn't eat it immediately. He just stared at it, watching it melt slightly, making sure it was real. Then he took a small spoonful and closed his eyes, savoring the cold sweetness, the richness, the sheer impossible luxury of dessert. "I dreamed about ice cream," he said to no one in particular. "In solitary confinement, when the torture got bad, I'd close my eyes and imagine eating ice cream, vanilla, exactly like this. And now it's real, and I don't know how to believe it." Lieutenant Mitchell and other medical staff moved through the cafeteria, checking on the men, offering reassurance, helping those who were struggling. The psychological impact of the meal was as significant as the nutritional. These men needed to understand that deprivation was over, that they were valued, that America had never forgotten them. "You're heroes," Lieutenant Mitchell told one table of POWs who were eating silently, still processing. "The whole country has been praying for your return. You're not forgotten. You never were." One pilot, Captain Thomas Williams, held for 6 years, looked up at her with haunted eyes. "They told us nobody cared, that America had moved on, that our families remarried and forgot us. Was that true?" "No," Mitchell said firmly. "Your families never stopped fighting for your return. The whole country knew your names. There were bracelets with POW names that people wore, movements demanding your release, constant pressure on North Vietnam. You were never forgotten, not for a single day." Williams nodded slowly, trying to absorb this information. After years of isolation and propaganda, truth felt foreign. But the steak was real. The ice cream was real. Maybe the rest was real too. As the meal continued, conversation began. POWs who'd been isolated from each other in various camps shared experiences, comparing torture methods, survival strategies, camp conditions. There was dark humor, jokes about rat meat and bugs in rice, about guards and interrogations, the kind of humor that helped process trauma. But there was also grief. Grief for time lost, for youth stolen, for fellow prisoners who hadn't survived. Grief for the men they'd been before capture versus the damaged men they'd become. The meal was celebration and mourning simultaneously. Captain McCain sat quietly, eating his steak and thinking about the 7.5 years since he'd tasted American food. He thought about the nights in solitary confinement when he'd wondered if he'd die in Vietnam, never seeing his family again. He thought about the propaganda sessions where captors had insisted America had abandoned them. He thought about the moment earlier that day when he'd stepped off the North Vietnamese plane onto American soil and realized it was finally, impossibly over. The ice cream sat melting in front of him. He'd survived. Against impossible odds, through torture and starvation and years of psychological warfare, he'd survived. And now he was eating ice cream in the Philippines, about to go home. He took another bite and let himself believe, for the first time in years, that he was actually safe, that the nightmare had ended, that the men who'd served steak and ice cream to former prisoners represented the America he'd been fighting for, the one that valued him, that had never stopped trying to bring him home, that cared enough to serve ice cream to damaged men who needed proof that humanity still existed. The meal lasted 2 hours. By the end, all 67 men had eaten something, though portions varied based on what their bodies could handle. They'd cried, laughed, shared stories, and begun the long process of returning to a world they'd been torn from years earlier. That night, sleeping in actual beds with clean sheets, full for the first time in years, they processed the day's impossibility. They'd survived, they were free, and someone had cared enough to serve them steak and ice cream. After everything, that simple meal meant more than they could express. Recovery wasn't instant. Bodies and minds damaged by years of torture and deprivation required time, patience, and care that the POWs were still learning to accept. The days following that first meal at Clark Air Base involved intensive medical treatment. Doctors cataloged the physical damage: malnutrition, parasites, untreated fractures that had healed incorrectly, dental disasters, scars from torture, hearing loss, vision problems, countless infections. Nearly all the POWs required significant medical intervention just to reach baseline health. Psychologically, the damage was equally profound but harder to quantify. Many suffered nightmares, waking, screaming from dreams that they were back in cells, that freedom had been illusion. Others experienced hypervigilance, unable to relax, constantly scanning for threats. Some struggled with survivor's guilt. Why had they lived when others died? What made them deserving of rescue? Could they have done more to help fellow prisoners? The medical staff at Clark had been specifically trained in POW reintegration, but nothing fully prepared them for the complexity of what these men carried. Lieutenant Mitchell found herself spending hours simply sitting with POWs, listening to stories they needed to tell, providing human connection after years of isolation. Commander Stockdale talked about the tap code that had saved his sanity, about talking through walls to fellow prisoners he couldn't see, about developing a resistance philosophy that gave meaning to suffering, about the constant calculation, how much torture before breaking, how to maintain honor while surviving. The worst part wasn't the physical pain, he told Mitchell one evening. It was the isolation, the deliberate erasure of your humanity. They wanted us to believe we were nothing, that nobody cared, that we'd die forgotten in those cells. The tap code let us prove they were wrong. We could communicate, resist, maintain community even when they tried to destroy it. Lieutenant Commander Alvarez struggled with food. After years of starvation, his body couldn't immediately process abundance. He'd eat small portions and become violently ill. Medical staff had to carefully manage his refeeding, gradually increasing calories to avoid refeeding syndrome, a dangerous condition where starved bodies react badly to sudden nutrition. "I dreamed about food for 8 years, he said during one session. Imagined elaborate meals, remembered flavors from childhood. But now that food is available, my body won't let me eat it. It feels like a cruel joke. I'm finally free, finally fed, but I can't enjoy it because I'm too damaged." The doctors reassured him this was temporary, that his digestive system would heal, that patience was required. But after years where survival meant accepting suffering, patience felt like weakness. Captain McCain required extensive physical therapy for injuries that had healed incorrectly during captivity. His broken bones had been left unset, resulting in limited range of motion and chronic pain. Therapists worked daily to restore what mobility they could, but some damage was permanent. During one painful session, a therapist apologized for causing discomfort. McCain laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "This is nothing compared to what the North Vietnamese did. At least you're trying to heal me. They were trying to break me. There's a difference." The psychological work was harder than the physical. Psychiatrists conducted careful assessments, documenting trauma while avoiding re-traumatization. Many POWs were reluctant to discuss their experiences in detail, partly from military stoicism, partly from psychological protection, partly from fear that speaking would make the memories more real. Group sessions helped. POWs who'd shared captivity could talk with each other in ways they couldn't with medical staff who hadn't experienced it. They developed dark humor about their experiences, jokes about rice rations, about guard personalities, about survival strategies. The humor was both coping mechanism and bonding, proof that torture hadn't destroyed their spirits entirely. One evening, several POWs organized an impromptu gathering in a recreation room. Someone found a guitar. They sang American songs, country, rock, folk, music they'd been denied for years. The sound drew other POWs and staff. For an hour, they made music together, laughing and crying simultaneously, processing freedom through rhythm and melody. Sergeant Williams, who'd asked Lieutenant Mitchell if his family had forgotten him, received his first phone call home. Hearing his wife's voice after 6 years broke something inside him. He sobbed for 20 minutes, unable to speak, just listening to her tell him she loved him, had never stopped loving him, had fought every day for his return. When he finally spoke, his first words were, "I thought you'd moved on. They told us you'd remarried, that you'd forgotten." "Never," she said firmly. "I wore your name on a bracelet every single day. I wrote letters even when they weren't delivered. I knew you were alive, and I never stopped waiting." That conversation healed something medication couldn't reach. The lie that nobody cared, that they'd been abandoned, was one of the cruelest aspects of captivity. Hearing families had fought for them, that America had demanded their return, that they'd been remembered and valued. It restored meaning to years of suffering. The POWs also supported each other through difficult moments. When one man had a nightmare and woke screaming, others who understood were there immediately. Not just staff, but fellow POWs who'd lived it, who could provide comfort rooted in shared experience. "We survived together," Commander Stockdale explained. "Even when physically separated, we were surviving together through the TAP code, through resistance philosophy, through shared knowledge that we weren't alone. Now we're recovering together. That brotherhood, it's what kept us alive then, and it's what will help us heal now." Meals continued to be significant. Each one reinforced that abundance was real, that deprivation had ended. The POWs began requesting favorite foods from childhood: burgers, pizza, their mother's recipes. Kitchen staff accommodated when possible, understanding that food was more than nutrition. It was proof of return to normalcy. One Thursday, exactly a week after their arrival, the kitchen served apple pie. Several POWs began crying, remembering American traditions they'd thought they'd never experience again. The pie was sweet and ordinary and perfect. They ate it slowly, savoring not just the taste, but what it represented. They were home, or close enough, and normal life was possible again. Progress came in small moments. The first night someone slept through without nightmares. The first meal someone finished without becoming sick. The first conversation where laughter wasn't edged with pain. The first time someone said, "I think I might be okay eventually," and meant it. Recovery would take years, even lifetimes. Some damage couldn't be undone, but in those days at Clark Air Base, surrounded by medical staff who cared and fellow survivors who understood, the POWs began the long journey back to humanity. They'd been deliberately dehumanized for years. Now they were being carefully, patiently, lovingly helped to remember they were human, valuable, and home. The steak and ice cream of that first meal became legendary among them, a marker of transition from captivity to freedom, from deprivation to abundance, from despair to hope. They'd carry the memory for the rest of their lives. The moment they realized their suffering had ended, that someone had cared enough to feed them well, that America had never forgotten them. The POWs returned to America as heroes, but heroism felt complicated for men who'd simply survived. The flights from Clark Air Base to the United States were emotional journeys. As planes crossed into American airspace, pilots announced the moment over intercoms. POWs cheered, wept, sat in stunned silence processing the impossible. They were home. Some hadn't seen America in 8 years. The country they'd left was different from the one they returned to. Vietnam War had divided the nation, protests had raged, politics had shifted. They'd been frozen in time while America moved forward without them. The homecomings were overwhelming. Families waiting at air bases, crowds cheering, media documenting every moment. President Nixon received them at the White House. The country celebrated their return with parades and ceremonies. After years of being told nobody cared, the outpouring of support was psychologically destabilizing, gratifying but difficult to process. Commander Stockdale returned to a Navy career but struggled with integration. He'd spent 7.5 years in captivity, 4 in solitary confinement. Normal military routine felt surreal. He eventually became a vice admiral and ran for vice president in 1992, but he carried psychological scars from torture and isolation that never fully healed. In later years, he wrote extensively about his captivity, particularly about the philosophy that sustained him. He'd drawn on Stoic principles learned at the Naval Academy. The idea that you can't control what happens to you, only how you respond. This philosophy helped him maintain dignity and resistance when everything else was stripped away. "I never lost faith in the end of the story," he wrote in his memoir. "I never doubted not only that I would get out, but also that I would prevail in the end and turn the experience into the defining event of my life, which, in retrospect, I would not trade." That last part, not trading the experience, seemed incomprehensible to many, but Stockdale explained that suffering, when survived with integrity, becomes transformative. He'd learned things about human resilience, about values, about what actually matters that he couldn't have learned any other way. Lieutenant Commander Alvarez returned after 8.5 years, the longest-held POW. His reintegration was complicated by the length of his absence. His daughter, who'd been an infant when he deployed, was now 9 years old and didn't remember him. His marriage struggled under the weight of trauma and changed circumstances. He eventually divorced, remarried, and built a new life, but the years in captivity left permanent marks. He wrote about his experiences in a memoir titled Chained Eagle, describing both the horror of captivity and the moments of humanity, fellow POWs supporting each other, the TAP code creating community, small acts of resistance that maintained dignity. He emphasized that survival hadn't been individual heroism, but collective endurance. "We survived because we had each other," he explained in interviews. "Even when separated, even when in solitary, we knew other Americans were nearby, resisting too. That knowledge, that we weren't alone, made the difference between giving up and enduring." Captain McCain built a political career partly on his POW experience, though he was reluctant to discuss details of torture. He served as a U.S. Senator for decades, using his experience to inform positions on military affairs, prisoner treatment, and American values. When debates arose about torture and interrogation after 9/11, McCain was unequivocal. Torture doesn't work, degrades the torturer, and violates American principles. "I know what it's like to be tortured," he said during Senate debates. "I know it makes you say anything to make it stop. You don't get truth from torture. You get whatever the victim thinks you want to hear. And, more importantly, torture makes us into the kind of nation that tortures. That's not who we are. That's not who we should be." His stance was rooted in direct experience. He'd been tortured and had eventually broken, signing a false confession. He carried guilt about that break for decades, despite military code acknowledging that everyone has a breaking point. His political career became, in part, an extended effort to ensure America never became like his captors, that values mattered even in war, especially in war. Not all POWs achieved public prominence. Many returned to quiet lives, working through trauma privately, building families and careers away from spotlights. Some thrived, using their experience to inform meaningful work. Others struggled. Marriages failed, careers stalled, substance abuse and mental health challenges emerged from unprocessed trauma. The military improved POW training based on their experiences. ZEER schools, survival, evasion, resistance, escape, incorporated lessons from Vietnam POWs about resistance techniques, psychological warfare, and survival strategies. The TAP code became standard training, the philosophy of resisting until the edge of rationality, then surviving, became official guidance. Decades later, when America went to war in Iraq and Afghanistan, Vietnam POW experiences informed detainee treatment policies, at least initially. The understanding that torture doesn't produce reliable intelligence, that humanitarian treatment aligns with American values, came directly from men who'd endured the opposite. In the 2000s and 2010s, as Vietnam POWs reached old age, many participated in oral history projects. They wanted their experiences documented, lessons preserved. Common themes emerged: the importance of community and survival, the power of resistance to maintain dignity, the psychological devastation of isolation, and the critical importance of values even when facing enemies who don't share them. Sergeant Williams, who'd had that first phone call home with his wife, built a quiet life in Montana. He rarely spoke about his captivity except to veterans groups, but in a 2015 interview he reflected, "That first meal at Clark, the steak and ice cream, it saved me in a way medicine couldn't. It proved that everything they'd told us was lies, that America hadn't forgotten us, that somebody cared." I think about that meal even now, 40 years later. It reminds me that humanity survives even when people try to destroy it. When the last Vietnam POWs began dying in the 2010s and 2020s, their obituaries noted not just their military service, but their survival, their endurance, their refusal to break completely even when breaking seemed inevitable. They'd lived decades beyond captivity, but those years in Vietnamese prisons remained the defining experience, the thing that shaped everything after. The story of 67 men shocked by steak and ice cream reveals a profound truth. Humans can survive unimaginable suffering if they retain connection, purpose, and hope. Those POWs endured torture and starvation and isolation that should have destroyed them. Instead, they developed communication systems, resistance philosophies, and mutual support that kept them alive physically and psychologically. When they returned and encountered abundance, something as simple as a meal with steak and ice cream, their shock wasn't just about food. It was about the collision between the world they'd survived and the world they'd returned to. It was proof that their suffering had ended, that the lies they'd been told in captivity were false, that America had never forgotten them. The meal was a beginning, not an ending. Recovery took years. Some wounds never healed. But that first dinner at Clark Air Base marked a transformation. From prisoners surviving deprivation to free men receiving care. From men who'd been systematically dehumanized to men being reminded of their humanity and value. They'd spent years eating rotten rice while being told nobody cared. Then someone served them steak and ice cream and proved that lie wrong. Sometimes the most powerful statement about human dignity is simply treating people with the care they deserve, even after, especially after, others have tried to destroy them. The Vietnam POWs came home carrying knowledge about human cruelty and human resilience. They'd seen the worst people can do to each other. But that first meal reminded them of something equally important. The best people can do for each other, the choice to value human dignity even when it's been denied, the decision to care even when indifference would be easier. They survived hell. They came home, and someone cared enough to serve them ice cream. After everything, that simple act of humanity mattered more than they could express. It meant they were home, they were valued, and their suffering, while never forgotten, was finally, impossibly over.